Down by the river, down by the river, to see what we can see. Down by the river, by the Hudson River, down by the river, that's where I want to be. You may be feeling cramped and crowded. You may be feeling restless and bored. I know a place in your wide hills. Leave you refreshed, with your mind restored. I'll meet you down by the river, down by the river, down by the river, to see what we can see. Down by the river, by the Hudson River, down by the river, that's where I want to be. You never know what you might find there. You never know what the tide will bring. But I know you'll find peace of mind there. Something about it makes me wanna sing. I'll meet you down by the river, down by the river, down by the river, to see what we can see. Down by the river, by the mighty Hudson, down by the river, that's where I wanna be. Just make your way down to the water. That river will bring the world to your feet. Might be something washed down from the mountains or dredged right up from the ocean deep. I'll meet you down by the river, down by the river, down by the river, to see what we can see. Down by the river, by the Hudson River, down by the river, that's where I want to be. Once we got careless about our river, let it fill up with pollution and trash. Now we're trying hard to protect it. Wanna make sure that our river will last. I'll meet you down by the river, down by the river, down by the river, to see what we can see. Down by the river, by the Hudson River, down by the river, that's where I want to be. I'll meet you down by the river, down by the river, down by the river, to see what we can see. Down by the river, by the Hudson River, down by the river, that's where I want to be. Down by the river, that's where I want to be. Down by the river, that's where I want to be. Down by the river, that's where I want to be.
Hello, everybody. My name is Steve Stanne. I'm the president of the board of Clearwater and one of the acting executive directors as well. And I would like to welcome you to our webinar tonight, celebrating the release of the Hudson, an illustrated guide to the living river. This is a Clearwater project that got its start back in the late 1980s, early 1990s, when, as education director of Clearwater, I would get calls from parents looking for information about the Hudson. They'd say, my son or daughter is doing a report on pollution in the Hudson. And I'd say, okay, that's a pretty big topic. Yeah, well, could you just send me some information about it? Well, yeah, but there's a lot to know about that. Well, that's okay, just send me something. By the way, could you send it right away? The report is due tomorrow. And I decided that really what we needed was a lot of that information between two covers of a book. And Clearwater was very fortunate to get funding, a big grant from the Hudson River Foundation, from other funders as well, to put together a book that we for which we used a working title called A Hudson River Primer. And drafts of that book were used in a lecture series at the American Museum of Natural History. And an attendee at that particular series was an editor from Rutgers University Press. She contacted us to ask if we'd be interested in having Rutgers, in fact, publish that book for us. We said yes, and the rest is history. The first edition came out in 1996, and it was used quite extensively. It justified a second edition, released in 2006. But as you might imagine, a lot of the issues addressed in these books became out of date fairly quickly. So we were asked to do another edition, a third edition, and that's the one that we're celebrating the release of tonight. The Hudson, An Illustrated Guide to the Living River, a third edition. It adds a number of things that are in addition to the updates of different environmental issues. The big thing is that it'll be printed largely in color. Some of the black and white illustrations will remain from the older editions, but a lot of the photographs will now be in color instead of in black and white. There's a new chapter in the book contributed by Maya Nemisto, Clearwater educator, former Clearwater educator, chapter on climate change. And in addition, we've interspersed through the chapters of the book sidebars, which suggest ways in which you can engage with the river beyond reading, places to go, websites to visit, activities to become involved with in conjunction with different river organizations. So we hope that you'll take an interest in the book. Ordering information for the book will be placed in chat, so you can check it out there, or you can go to the Clearwater website, www.clearwater.org, and click on the shop button in the uppermost part of that home page that you'll arrive at. And really, although it was designed for teachers originally, teachers working with their students, it's become a reference for anybody who wants to be a student of the river. Now, a few things about the book. The co-authors are, besides myself, historian Roger Panetta from Fordham University, former educator, now on the faculty at Indiana State University, and Brian Forrest, and former Clearwater educator Maya Nemisto, who's now with the Hudson River Estuary Program at the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. Our original plans for this series were to have the four co-authors present the four webinars in the series. Unfortunately, Maya could not join us. However, we were able to get a very able replacement, a scientist who is one of the leading researchers on the river and whose work was, in fact, cited widely in the book, and that is Dr. David Strayer. He is emeritus ecologist at the Carey Institute of Ecosystem Studies in Millbrook, and he will be giving the last talk of the series. He's an expert on mollusks. He was the right person in the right time when the zebra mussel invasion happened in the river. He's also a great presenter, so we're really lucky to have him. But you'll enjoy all of the presentations, I'm sure. These are folks who have a long history on the river. A book like this doesn't happen without participation and assistance from lots of people. And I'd like to thank a few of them here, in addition to the co-authors, the scientists and historians and researchers whose work really forms the foundation of the book. Dave and Roger are really researchers and experienced in doing and digging out new facts, asking new questions about the history and the science of the river. The other co-authors are really educators who take that and try to present it in ways that are engaging. But we really depend on those scientists and historians and other researchers. A book like this, it is an illustrated guide to the living river. So the designers, the illustrators, the photographers, the collectors, and institutions who provided permission to use are folks that we absolutely need to thank. I'd like to give a shout out to the Rutgers staff and editors, along with our many colleagues over the years who have contributed advice and review and other assistance. And finally, the funders, the grant makers, again, especially the Hudson River Foundation, who contributed to the initial edition, and also Clearwater members who made it possible for us to get the book out. So tonight we're going to be focusing on the physical river. The title of the webinar, Time and Rivers Flowing, is actually the title of a Pete Seeger song. And as you probably mostly know, Pete was one of the founding members of Clearwater and an inspiration to us all. But it's also an interesting way to look at this first of the webinar series. And we're going to start with some pretty basic questions. For example, how deep is the river? The deepest portions are in the Hudson Highlands, south of, this is Breakneck Ridge, or view from Breakneck Ridge. The deepest spot in the river, in fact, is just around the corner on the left-hand side of the slide there at a place called World's End. And I had the opportunity to go on a research vessel there a few years ago, and we ran the depth sounder while we were there, and we found a depth of 179 feet, which is roughly on par with the mapping that's been done of the Hudson River bottom in the last few decades. And it's around 177 feet at low tide. That's the deepest spot that was found. But there are many spots over 100 feet in the Hudson Highlands. And if you look at the slopes of the highlands, the spectacular scenery of the highlands, you'll notice that they're very steep, and they continue to be that steep underwater. You could basically sail the Clearwater right up to the shore and not be in danger of hitting anything. It's the drop-offs are so steep. And that really has to do with the history, the geological history of the Hudson. If you'd been here maybe 18,000 years ago, 15,000 years ago, this is what it might have looked like, with the tongue of the continental ice sheets coming down through the Hudson Highlands, and actually at this point wasting away, melting back. And the incredible power of that ice, after all, it was thousands of feet thick over New York City and over this region. That really eroded a very deep gouge where the Hudson Channel already existed. Matter of fact, right now that channel is filled with debris, with sediment, with gravel, with sand, with rock that's come into the river or that was dropped by the glacier. But when it was moving through, it gouged the channel over 700 feet deep at Storm King, Breakneck Ridge, and almost as deep at the Tappan Zee. Now, of course, these deep channels, the deep gouges have been filled in over time. Interestingly, once you get down to the Narrows, where the Verrazano Bridge is, that bedrock bottom is only a couple hundred feet down. So it's deeper upstream than it is at the mouth of the river, owing to the fact of the power of that depth of glacial ice. And looking at these features, some geologists have classified the Hudson as a fjord, similar to what you would see in Norway or in Alaska. After the glaciers melted, the Hudson Valley was filled with a glacial lake, probably a few icebergs floating around into it, a lot of very fine sediments called rock flour from the glacial erosion were deposited in that lake in thick beds of clay that later became the source of raw materials for brickmaking in the Hudson Valley. At the same time, there were many streams that brought sand and gravel into this lake, forming deltas. Croton Point is a good example of such a delta. The Cowaweesee, Plum Point in New Windsor is another example. Now, that glacial lake would have been fairly turbid, but the river itself is still turbid. And particularly in the channel, that has impacts on its productivity, on what sort of life you find there. This picture looking north from the Mid-Hudson Bridge shows a stream of turbidity, of mud, being resuspended by tidal action in the river. And you only have to go down a few feet in the Hudson before it gets quite dark. And when you get down 60 feet or so, which is the depth here in the river off of Poughkeepsie, then it's black as night. And that sediment comes partly from the tidal suspension of sediments that are already on the bottom. It comes from wakes that erode the shorelines. Uh, and interestingly, I would often get calls from folks going across the walkway over the Hudson. And they'd say, yes, Steve, I was looking down from the walkway and I looked at this stream that comes in here, the Falkhill, and it looks like there's pollution coming out there. Well, actually, that's not pollution. That's clear water. You're looking down through that stream coming out of the Falkhill's mouth there to the bottom of the river. You can actually see it. Uh, the I won't call it pollution, but the Hudson is the stream that actually is discolored here by all of the turbidity, all of the sediment, the fine sediments suspended in that river. How wide is the river? Well, the widest spot is Haverstraw Bay, and it extends from going from west to east from Croton on Hudson over to Haverstraw. It's about 3.5 miles wide, roughly speaking. Notice the blue, the light blue colors on this nautical chart of Haverstraw Bay. Those are areas that are less than 18 feet deep. And if you're able to look closely, you can see that really much of that blue area in Haverstraw Bay is actually only between 8 and 10 feet deep, quite shallow. That is hazardous for Clearwater, perhaps, when it's trying to sail through there with its centerboard down. But it's a great boon to the river. That means that light can penetrate through most of the water column there, almost all the way to the bottom, and in some conditions, perhaps to the bottom. And given the width of Haverstraw Bay and the Tappan Zee shown here, it becomes a huge solar trap for catching solar energy. And of course, plants in the river need that solar energy to photosynthesize. And in those shallows, they can do that successfully. Here in this region of the river, most of those plants, loosely speaking, are in fact algae, phytoplankton, the plankton that drift with the little organisms that drift on the tides and photosynthesize to produce the food that's used in the food chain. Further north, there are quite a few shallows, particularly once you get north of Kingston, and especially once you get north of Catskill and Hudson. Matter of fact, on this particular chart, which shows an area just north of Kingston, New York, and shows the Rhinecliff-Kingston Bridge at the upper end of the chart, you'll notice that there is a shallow area called the Flat, right in the middle of the river. It's only 3 or 4 feet deep at low tide. And if you may find it puzzling to look down and see a ship moving up the river as you cross the bridge, and it'll be hugging the west shore of the river here, just because that's where the channel is. It's not in the middle. Those shallows, as with the shallows in the Tappan Zee and Haverstraw Bay, become a place where plants can grow, light can penetrate to the bottom. And here it's not so much plankton, and I think Dave Strayer may have something to say about that in his talk in a few weeks. But more the dominant plant forms in these shallows are the rooted vegetation, which we call SAV, submerged aquatic vegetation. Now, those shallows are great places for plants to grow, but they're also tough places in which to survive, because in the winter, yes, we still do have winters occasionally, and the ice flows that travel up and down the river with the tidal currents end up scraping over those shallows and gouging them out, piling up in big windrows like this. And that can be obviously a very tough thing for organisms to survive. How long is the river? Well, I'll give you the most commonly cited figure. From Lake Tyr in the Clouds to the Battery in New York City, it's 315 miles long as the river runs. Now, if you are a cartographer and you were measuring from where the Hudson starts on your maps to where it ends on your maps, it wouldn't be that long, because in order to get from Lake Tyr down to where the Hudson is first named the Hudson, water has to flow through first Little Feldspar Brook, then to the Opalescent River. Then there's a channel of the Opalescent called Calamity River. And it's where the Calamity Brook rather, it's where Calamity Brook meets the outlet stream from Henderson Lake near Newcomb that the name Hudson River first appears on the map. Looking at the other end, down at New York City, on maps, the Hudson ends at the Battery, the southern tip of Manhattan. And that's convenient for us as we categorize these water bodies, but I'm sure that the fish swimming by there don't notice any difference as they swim from the upper bay of New York Harbor to into the Hudson River, as it's shown on maps. And although Lake Tyr is commonly said to be the source of the Hudson, is it really? Now, you might ask, might the source of the river be Muddy Brook on Mount Greylock in Massachusetts? Might it be the Westkill flowing out of the Catskills off of Hunter Mountain? Or is it this runoff into a storm drain in New Paltz? All of these streams of water could end up in the Hudson because they're all within the watershed of the river. Now, people often ask, what is a watershed? Well, it's an area that's defined by the fact that any drop of water that lands within in this case, the green and the colored area of the map, will flow downhill, drawn by gravity. And within the area shown on that map, it will eventually get to the Hudson River if it doesn't evaporate or soak into the ground or something like that. So that is really what defines the watershed. It's the area of land from which water will flow into the particular stream, which is assigned to that watershed. The Hudson River watershed is about 13,000 square miles, the size perhaps of Massachusetts and Connecticut together, something like that. It dominates much of eastern New York. Now we're going to focus on a particular part of the Hudson, that being the portion from Troy down to New York City. But I don't want to lose sight of the fact that it's part of this larger watershed, because what goes on in the larger watershed will certainly affect what happens in the portion of the Hudson that we're going to look at tonight. Likewise, there's that big blue area down at the southern end of the river, the ocean, and it too has impacts on the Hudson, because in fact, the Hudson is an estuary. It's influenced by both the ocean and the watershed. An estuary is an area, is a body of water partially enclosed by land in which salt and fresh water come together. And that certainly characterizes the Hudson. You can go on a field trip up in the freshwater portions of the Hudson, and you might find zebra mussels on the shore or on rocks there. You might, if you do a seine net or go fishing, you might catch a largemouth bass. But if you're down in the lower portion of the Hudson, you might catch a bluefish or find barnacles on the rocks. And in some places, in some years, maybe around Newburgh, you might catch both bluefish and largemouth bass, and you might find on a given rock both a few zebra mussels and a few barnacles that are able to survive at the limits of their respective ranges. Now, I want to talk first about the influences of the watershed on the river. Of course, the water itself comes off the watershed, but many things are in that water. One of them, and one of the most important, is detritus and organic carbon that had its origins with plants and animals in the watershed. These dead leaves, for example, they're going to get washed into the Hudson via this, or they're going to get washed into the stream, and they may get broken down there into detritus, or they may keep flowing all the way to the Hudson. But they become a source of food for the river. We think of food chains oftentimes as starting with green plants and going through the little animals up to the bigger animals. Well, in the Hudson, the major source of food isn't the green plants, or even, well, in some places, the phytoplankton. In the lower river, phytoplankton plays a big role. But in the freshwater river, green plants have only a small contribution to the food chains of the river. Instead, it's largely detritus-based. Organisms like this amphipod, also called a scud or a side swimmer, they attack these dead leaves and other detritus and eat it, turn it into animal tissue that can be eaten by fish and by other larger organisms. And we'll hear more about fish and about food chains in the later talks in the series. Other things come down off the watershed. These two pictures show the movement of two important nutrients, phosphorus and nitrogen, through the watershed into the river. And these are from the book, and they show a nice pastoral or natural view of the movement of these nutrients through the system. But in fact, people have quite an impact on these nutrients and their supply for the river. Uh, we fertilize our fields, and sometimes the runoff from that fields will carry nitrogen and phosphorus into nearby streams, and that can cause problems if there's too much of it. It can over enrich the system. Similarly, uh, fertilizing your lawn can have the same effect. And New York State has passed laws limiting the application and the use of fertilizers with large amounts of phosphorus in them in order to protect water quality. And then, of course, there's sewage. Now, in large part, sewage has been cleaned up in the river. There still are some issues with combined sewer overflows. I won't get into that tonight. Um, but as a result of the Clean Water Act, and sewage treatment plants were built along the river and have done have played a major role in cleaning up sewage from the river. But many of these plants are not equipped to actually remove nutrients. And so they are sources of nutrients to the system as well, again, with the potential to over enrich the system. And maybe you're thinking, well, what does this have to do with watersheds? Well, if you're in New York City, for example, this is the North River Sewage Treatment Plant under construction just south of the George Washington Bridge. It was completed in 1986. Uh, but if you are in New York City, in a sense, you're part of the watershed because your water comes from the Catskills. This is the Ashokan Reservoir. It gets diverted from the Hudson and travels by aqueduct down to New York City, where it goes through kitchen sinks, bathroom sinks, etc., and then through sewage treatment plants and back into the Hudson. It ends up there eventually. Other things that come down with the water from the watershed and the tributaries of the river, this is the Mohawk River, the Cohoes Falls. Uh, Again, besides the water itself, uh, are some of the turbidity that impacts the river. This photo shows what the Mohawk River looked like after hurricane or tropical storm Irene. Some of you may remember that, 2011. And this radar picture of it shows the heaviest rain bands, the yellow and some patches of red and orange there, right over southeastern New York, right over the watershed of the Hudson. There were areas of the Catskills that got 13 inches of rain in a matter of maybe 8 hours or so. And the results for the Hudson were, and for that, the watershed and the communities of the Catskills were catastrophic. In the case of the Hudson, what was the impact of that? Well, there was some flooding, more about that later, but the impact was really ecologically felt largely by these plants that I mentioned earlier, the SAV, the submerged aquatic vegetation. That turbidity clouded up the water much more than usual. And interestingly, what happened as a result is that the plants in the river were no longer able to photosynthesize. And here's a graph. I'm going to talk more about interpreting graphs in a little while, but this graph shows you a plot of dissolved oxygen in the water, dissolved oxygen saturation at Norrie Point. That's the mid-Hudson, a little bit south of Kingston, north of Poughkeepsie. And the blue plot shows the dissolved oxygen levels in the water there leading up to Tropical Storm Irene. You can see that they were pretty good, 90 to 95% saturation, which is not bad at all. There was a little dip here. I don't know exactly what caused that, but it went back up. And then Irene came through late in August, and look what happened. The dissolved oxygen just dropped right off, down to only 80% saturation. And this was because of turbidity blocking light to those plants. What's really interesting about this, and where the long-range impacts, the large impacts came on, is that in the following year, you see similar low levels of oxygen at the same place, because that that mud that was deposited in the river as a result of Irene covered up the roots, the tubers of the submerged aquatic vegetation, limiting its ability to come back and grow. And as a result, levels of oxygen were lower in subsequent years. Matter of fact, one more plot to show you. Here's 2013. You can see that dissolved oxygen levels are still low, perhaps even a little lower than they were the previous year. Again, due to the turbidity the mud brought in as a result of all that rainfall from Tropical Storm Irene. So those are some of the watershed influences on the river. What about the influences of the Atlantic Ocean, moving up under the Verrazano Bridge at the Narrows and up into the harbor of New York and further up the river? Well, one of the ones that's probably most familiar is the tides and tidal currents. This is a view from the walkway looking to the north. There's a navigational buoy there, and you can see from the pattern of eddies around that red buoy that the current is moving north. In this case, it's moving away from the ocean. It's called a flood current. And a few hours later, if you come back, it will have switched direction. And the eddies around the buoy now show that it's flowing south. This is called the ebb current, the current flowing towards the ocean. The indigenous peoples who lived along the river had a lot of different names for it, but one of them was Mexicantuk, spelled a variety of different ways, which very loosely translated means river that flows both ways. Perhaps more accurate would be great waters in constant motion. But river that flows both ways is a poetic expression of that that's becoming it's come into common use. In addition to the currents, we also have the rise and fall of the tide, and this takes place on the Hudson as far north as the dam at Troy, the Federal Lock-in Dam at Troy. The river is really at sea level, pretty much all the way up to Troy. So if you were to hang out here fishing or picnicking or in a playground right next to it, you might in fact notice over a course of 6 hours that the water level rises and falls. And this is due to the action of ocean tides moving up the Hudson. The tides are not generated in the Hudson itself, they're generated in the ocean, and they move up the Hudson. 153 miles from the Battery at New York City to the Troy Dam. So that the organisms that live in the river, in the shallows at least, need to be able to adapt to very changeable conditions. This is a plant called spatterdock, which is one of the few rooted plants that can deal with this constantly being for a few hours out of the water, in the sun, in the heat, in the cold, and then a few hours later being basically completely submerged as the tide comes up. It's a tough environment to live in, but this plant and a few others have managed to do that. Animals, of course, have learned to move to get out of the way or to move when the tide might leave them high and dry. I want to talk a little bit about the range of those high and low tides, and here I am going to get into some graphs, and I'll start with an anecdote. A few years ago, I taught a lifetime learning course at SUNY New Paltz. It was a 4-session course, and at the end of it, a student came up to me and said, I really enjoyed your course, but I have to tell you that I nearly didn't come back after the first session. I said, well, why? He said, well, you showed so many graphs, and I just don't get graphs. Well, so I'm going to try to avoid that situation here and give you an idea of how to interpret them if you're not used to it already. Really, graphs are just one more way to tell a story. And you may think it looks a little complicated, but not if you break it down. There's a few things you want to look at, notice when you study any graph. First, where is it? If it's a graph that shows geography, and in this case, it is a graph made at the port. One of the plots is made at the Port of Albany. The blue plot is made at the Port of Albany. The orange plot was made near Poughkeepsie. However, they are both made over the same time span, the same range of days, 2 days from September 7th, 2019 to through September 8th, 2019. And what is being measured? what's being measured is the elevation of the water, how high the water is uh, compared to a certain baseline. And now the interesting question here is, what's different about these two things? How do the tides at Albany differ from those in Poughkeepsie? And I'll give you a minute or so just to look and think about that. I'll give you a clue that there are two big differences that you might notice as you look at this. The first is that any given tide happens later in Albany. The tide, the high and low tide are actually part of a wave that moves up the river from the ocean. Not a tsunami, it's a tidal wave, but not a tidal wave in the sense that a tsunami is. Uh, and I believe, if I remember correctly, it moves up at a speed of about 17 miles per hour as it goes up the Hudson. So it takes a while for a given low tide or a given high tide to travel from Poughkeepsie, in this case, up to Albany. So as you can see here, this is I put this line in, this dashed line, at the peak of a high tide in Poughkeepsie. And over the course of a few hours, it becomes high tide at Albany. Now that, looking at that motion from the yellow to the orange to the blue plot might also give you a clue as to what the second major difference is here. And that is that the tides are more extreme in Albany. And if you think about it, that tidal wave, as it moves up the Hudson, is getting into narrower and shallower water. And if you know anything about waves at the ocean, as they come off the ocean and come into the shallow water, they get higher, and then of course they crest and break and crash. Well, a similar phenomenon happens in the river as the tidal wave moves up the river. So that you see, here's the difference between high and low tide in Poughkeepsie. And again, a few hours later, when that same tide reaches Albany, it's much more extreme. The highs are higher, the lows are a little lower. So that's just a phenomenon that you'll notice along the river. The tides are highest, or more extreme, I should say, at either end of the river, down near the Battery, and again up near the Troy Dam. Now here's another graph of the river. It also shows water level. Let's break down what we're seeing in this graph. It comes from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. It shows conditions at the Battery at New York. And the date over several days was in 2012, from October 28th to October 31st. Now this graph has an additional little detail. It shows both the predicted tides in blue. Those are predicted according to astronomical factors that affect tides, mainly the movements and the distance and positions of the sun and moon. But it also shows what actually happened in the green. And in some graphs, if you were getting fresh data, it might just say it's preliminary. It hadn't been reviewed yet. But this has been reviewed, and it shows this huge peak in water levels occurring in late October of 2012. And some of you may well remember what occurred at that time. This is storm surge. This is a wall of water being pushed into New York Harbor from Hurricane Sandy, or Superstorm Sandy, as it swung west across New Jersey and New York. And the impacts, as you may remember, were extreme. In addition to many deaths, the subway tunnels were flooded. The southern part of Manhattan was blacked out. It was a huge impact that we're still trying to repair in many ways today, and now trying to plan for as we think about the impacts of climate change on the river. You might wonder if that storm surge actually came up the Hudson. And again, I'm looking now at plots from that same time, the 29th through the 31st, through, actually in this case through November, well, through the 31st, ending at November 1st. And looking again at the Port of Albany and at Poughkeepsie in red this time, Port of Albany in orange. And you can see that as you go across here, there's a peak at Poughkeepsie, and then at Albany, as that storm surge went right up the river. Remember that the Hudson is at sea level pretty much all the way to Troy. So as a result, level of the ocean will be reflected in what you see at the Troy Dam and up near Albany. And in fact, there was quite a lot of damage, particularly down in Westchester and Rockland counties. This is a marina in Stony Point in Rockland County. And of course, with climate change, we expect, and matter of fact, I believe it's now been proven that storms like Irene and Sandy are intensifying due to climate change, both in terms of the intensity of the rainfall and in terms of the power of the winds. It's interesting to look at the difference, though. This is a graph that shows some difference between the two impacts. The top graph shows, again, another version of the graph from Albany showing the storm surge. It's a very damaging and high but brief peak, whereas you see a little bit of storm surge from Irene at the start of the storm, then it goes down a little bit. Then all that water starts flowing down the watershed, comes off the watershed down the Mohawk and down from the upper Hudson, and several days of flooding ensue as a result of that extreme rainfall from Irene. Now, one of the other obvious impacts of the ocean on the estuary is that salt from the ocean, salty seawater, penetrates the Hudson. And sort of an extreme example of what controls that, it really depends on the amount of runoff coming off of the watershed. This is again an example of the impacts that Irene had on the river. A graph, it shows salinity, as you can see down here. It's at Castle Point. Castle Point is located in Hoboken, across from Manhattan. And on this buoy here, there is a sensor that tells what's going on in the water there in near real time. And in this case, and through the latter part of August, you can see that there's about 15 PSU, practical salinity units. It varies with the tidal currents as the saltier water on the flood tide goes past the sensor, the salinity goes up. Then as the ebb tide brings fresher water down, the salinity at the sensor goes down. So there's this up and down pattern that reflects the tides. But then you go to around the 28th or 29th of August, as Irene's rainfall started to flow down the river, and you see a precipitous drop in the level of salt in the water from about half of oceanic salinity at 15 PSU down to zero, basically, to no salinity. The Hudson River at this point was basically fresh water all the way down to Manhattan. So the amount of runoff from the watershed controls how far into the Hudson the salt goes. In a normal year, you might expect that it would reach Newburgh, perhaps the Newburgh-Beacon Bridge in the summer when there's not so much rain. In spring, when there tends to be more, generally the salt front, the leading edge of dilute salt water, will be around the Tappan Zee. But again, that's a very rough estimate, and it varies quite a bit. Now, I've talked about the storms, particularly Sandy. I'd like to just briefly mention climate change again here. I think Dave Strayer will talk more about climate change, so I won't go too deeply into it today. But one of the notable impacts is that if we have storms like Sandy in the future, or even lesser storms, they'll be starting from a higher baseline. Records at the battery from the station that I showed you earlier indicate that sea level has been steadily rising since the 1850s, about 17 inches over that time, about a foot over the last century. And more recent data shows that the pace of sea level rise seems to be accelerating a bit over the last decade or so at the battery. So obviously, the storm surge is going to start from a higher base, given sea level rise due to climate change. And a lesser storm than Sandy could have similar effects just because of that elevation in sea level. I'll close out my discussion of the oceanic impacts by talking about what brings the ocean salt up the river. Uh, when I ask that question live, people will say, well, the tides. And indeed, you can see that signal I mentioned a little bit earlier. This is a plot of salt at West Point, at the South Dock at West Point. And it's in the late summer when salt tends to be moving up the river because there's less runoff. And you'll notice as you look at the plot that it does go up and down. And if I were to plot tides as well, you might see a relationship there again, because on the ebb tide, fresh water is moving past the sensor. Then when the flow goes the other way on the flood tide, saltier water moves past the sensor. So it goes up and down. But notice that it's getting steadier, saltier, more steadily salty over this period of about 5 days from August 25th to the 30th. And you might wonder, well, why that is. Do the tides did that? Do the tides bring that salt up? Well, let me show you a plot of the tides. As you look at that, you see that there's really not much difference over that 5-day period in the level of the tides, or presumably as well in the tidal currents. Yet there still is that increase in salinity over that time. So yes, the tides will move the salt back and forth a matter of, I don't know, maybe 8 to 10 miles at most over the course of the tidal cycles, but that doesn't account for the increase that we observe over the 5 days. So what's going on? Well, if I had an aquarium and I put a partition down the middle of it and separated into 2 compartments, and on one side I put a lot of salt in the water and then some food coloring, maybe blue, and then on the other side I just left it plain and left it fresh. And then I slowly lifted that partition out of the middle of the aquarium. What would happen? Well, some of you might think, well, it'll blend and it'll become evenly blue. In fact, what happens is that salt water flows down to the bottom underneath the fresh water, because salt water is denser than fresh water. Now, in the Hudson, you have a huge aquarium, essentially a very long and huge aquarium, with a huge supply of salt water at the ocean end. And what happens is essentially the same thing. That dense salt water is basically being pulled by gravity up the Hudson. Remember, we're at sea level all the way to Troy. So that salt water is going to try and push under the fresh water, being denser. And the fresh water will tend to flow over at the top. And it's this, what's called estuarine circulation, that actually brings the salt front up the river. The tidal currents just move it back a few miles on each tidal cycle. The tides may have been one of the things that brought Henry Hudson up the river looking for the Northwest Passage. The river being tidal far inland probably gave him high hopes that this would be the way through North America to China. And in his investigations, on this particular day, September 6th, he was actually anchored below the Narrows, but he sent a small boat up into what we now call the Upper Bay of New York, and they went into what they describe as a river on the west side of the harbor of the Upper New York Bay. And they came back saying the lands, they told us, were as pleasant with grass and flowers and goodly trees as ever they had seen, and very sweet smells came from them. If you know the geography there, then you know that the river they were exploring in their small boat was actually the Kill Van Kull, and those sweet smells have been replaced by smells of petroleum. I'm not knocking it. I drive to work some days and use gasoline. But I just use this as an example of how humans have changed the system over time to be something quite different from what it was when Henry Hudson explored it. I don't know that the Hudson was clearer then. The resuspension of sediments by tides would have kept it pretty muddy. But in other ways, it's changed. And even up here in the upper river, this is a view from just north of Hudson, New York, towards the Catskills. Things look very natural here. But even in this area, the river has been changed in ways that are probably permanent, at least in our lifetimes. Now, this section of the river is problematic for vessels navigating the Hudson. Jewett mentions in this particular journal entry, the 17th, fair, sun-shining weather and very hot. In the morning, as soon as the sun was up, we set sail and ran up 6 leagues higher and found shoals, shallow areas, in the middle of the channel and small islands, but 7 fathoms of water, that would be about 42 feet, on both sides. Toward night, we barred so near the shore that we grounded. They went aground. So we laid out our small anchor and heaved off again. I'll mention that Clearwater would sometimes go aground in this section of the river. And what he means by that is that if you go aground and you turn on the engine and that's not enough to get you off, then what you do is you put the anchor in your yawl boat, in the small boat, you row it to the channel, you drop it, and then the crew pulls the boat to the anchor. It's hard work, but that's what they're doing here. They're heaving off the shallow. And then he goes on to say, then we borrowed on the bank in the channel, in the middle of the channel, and came aground again. When the flood ran, when the tide started to move up the river and it came up, we heaved off again and anchored all night. So this has always been a problematic area for mariners, and even more so in modern times when the Port of Albany is in fact a port that receives very large ocean-going vessels. They have to be able to navigate to that spot safely. Well, over time, accommodations have been made for commercial traffic on the river, for navigation on the river. This is a chart of the Athens area, Athens-Hudson area. I believe this dates from 1915. And you'll notice right in the middle of the chart, this stippled area. This is a flat that it's submerged probably at high tide, but obviously a very shallow area. Boats have to go to the west or to the east of it to safely navigate up to Albany. You can see the narrowness of that channel up near the north end of the chart. So over time, it's been changed. This is what the chart looks like today. On this modern day chart, you can see that that area that was once a flat is now an island, the middle ground flats, and that the folks who engineer the river have decided that the east channel is the way that boats will get up to the ocean and they are up to Albany, and they dredged that out to a depth of 32 feet. And that's the established channel depth for the Hudson. And those dashed lines indicate that the channel between has been dredged. Looks quite different these days. So this is a William Guy Wall print of a view from Athens towards Hudson in the 1800s, and you can see that flat, the grassy area growing in the middle of the picture in the middle of the Hudson here. Today, it's an island with trees growing on it. Here's a tug and barge making use of that east channel. And the changes up in this section of the river to accommodate shipping have been pretty extreme. And a former colleague, Dan Miller, has created this next set of slides to indicate just how much that's changed. Here's a chart that goes back to 1890, showing basically the historic conditions. And I'm going to ask you to notice, in particular, Shad Island over here. Shad being, of course, a very important fish in the river, and I believe that this is an area where a famous fish culturist, Seth Green, had a shad hatchery as well by Shad Island. Now, Dan filled in some of the areas here just to make it a little easier to interpret. The green are islands between the shores of the river as it existed then, which those shorelines are shown in red. Well, the first attempt to try and improve navigation was to put dikes down along what was perceived to be the main channel with the intention of directing the current into this main channel and eroding the bottom of the river to a greater depth. And that helped a little bit, but as time went on and vessels got larger, more drastic measures were needed. And in the 20th century, as I mentioned before, dredges went in and dug out that channel. Where did they put the spoil, the mud that they were digging up from the bottom? Well, they put it off in the side channels on top of those flats and islands that existed there. And now to simplify things, here's what the river looks like now. You can see where the former shorelines were. They're still outlined in red. But notice that the places that were once islands, including Shad Island, are no longer islands. Shad Island is at best a peninsula. Take a look at Poplar Island up here. It's just you'd be hard pressed to find an island there now. And these changes are likely permanent. Nobody's going to go back now and put the river back to what it was, except on a small scale. And the Hudson River Estuary Program and the National Estuary Research Reserve Program are doing some restoration work in some of the side channels to reestablish flow through these side channels, because it turns out that those shallows behind those islands and flats were important habitat. Those are spawning areas for shad and other fish. These are American shad, actually, in the Connecticut River, where they have a fishway. You can see them swimming by. In a sense, we've replaced one sort of habitat with another. Instead of having a watery habitat where fish swim, we now have a wooded habitat, which is utilized by bald eagles. And in fact, it was on one of these dredge spoil islands that the recovery of bald eagles, a nesting bird in the Hudson Valley, began. That was with the hatch of this nestling, first bald eagle born, or hatched, I should say, along the Hudson River in 100 years, back in 1997. And this was in that upper stretch of the river on one of those dredge spoil islands that had become a woodland. Robert Jewett continues. The 2 and 20th was fair weather. In the morning, our masters mate and 4 more of the company went up with our boat to sound the river higher up. This night at 10 of the o'clock, our boat returned in a shower of rain from sounding of the river, and found it to be at an end for shipping to go in. For they had been up 8 or 9 leagues and found but 7 foot of water and unconstant soundings. So this was the dashing of Henry Hudson's dreams of finding the Northwest Passage. But what he did find was to be equally important, or not equally, but extremely important to New York State. What he did find by exploring up the Hudson was the Mohawk River and its tributaries, a major tributary of the Hudson. And if you look west from the Hudson Valley towards the Great Lakes, you can see the geographic or topographic situation that inspired DeWitt Clinton and others to envision a canal from the Hudson to the Great Lakes. And at a time when water was the main form of transportation, that canal became an extremely important waterway. It made New York the Empire State. And the reason that it was able to be so successful, and a canal like this didn't happen, or wasn't built further south, was that the Hudson main stem goes through the highlands at sea level. So you didn't have to build a canal down there. You could sail up to Albany with a seagoing vessel and then transfer cargoes to the canal to go out to the Great Lakes. Or you could ship grain and other goods from the Great Lakes into the Hudson Valley and ultimately to New York City. And that was the presence of the Erie Canal and the commerce that built along there, along the canal and through the canal, is really responsible for New York becoming the financial center that it is today, and the great city that it is today. Today, the canal is not used much commercially. It is used recreationally. It has another more problematic potential, and that is that creatures that live in the Great Lakes watershed have in the past and could in the future use the canal to gain entrance to the Hudson River. And I believe that Dave Strayer will probably talk more about that in his talk. I'm going to close with just a reminder. If you want to find out what's going on in the river right now, a great way to do it is to visit the Hudson River Environmental Conditions Observing System, an online dashboard that allows you to see near real-time conditions at quite a few spots along the river and into the tributaries. This chart on the lower right tells you whether the sensors or that particular station are working, if they're online. By clicking on the current conditions link here, you can go to the dashboard that allows you to create the sorts of graphs that I did before. You can select what stations you want information for. You can select the parameters, both weather parameters and hydrologic, the water parameters. I'm going to show you a graph that I created just over the last couple of weeks, or showing the last couple of weeks in terms of the water elevation and the salinity of the water at Piermont. this is with the selection I've made. So here again, you see the phenomenon that I showed you earlier when we were talking about how the salt moves up the river. But it's interesting that you may all remember that we had a huge amount of rain a few weeks ago. And you can see that reflected in the fact that at Piermont, which is just below the Tappan Zee Bridge, the salinity went down to a very low level. And it's only now starting to creep back up as of January 6th or so. It's starting to creep back up the river, move back up the river as the runoff from the watershed ends. And also as it gets very cold, so that ice forms and there's less runoff because of that as well. So if you'd like to visit the HRECOS, as we call it, the Hudson River Environmental Conditions Observing System, it's free, it's fun to play around with, and you can find it at www.hrecos.org. And I believe that the address for this will be in chat. By the way, I forgot to mention at the very beginning of this that if you have questions about any of the things that I presented here, type them into the Q&A, and I'll try to answer them for you as we finish up, which I'm going to do right now. Thank you to all of you for attending. I'd also like to thank our production team, Peter Capek, Meg Mayo, Rosemary, and Alan Thomas. For more information about Clearwater, you can visit our website. If you'd like to order the Hudson, you can, again, as I mentioned at the beginning, go to the webpage, the homepage, and click on the shop button at the very top of the page. So with that, I'm going to stop the share here and be available to answer questions. Actually, maybe I won't stop the share, but I'll just have Meg Mayo, who I believe is checking chat and Q&A. If she has any questions that people have asked, I'd be happy to try and answer them now.
Steve, I do have a couple of questions that are in the chat. We had one question from Susan. She's asking, are zebra mussels edible?
I don't know of people who eat them. I would imagine that some people have tried, but no, they're not like blue mussels. That'd be a good question for Dave Strayer when he's on in a few weeks.
Okay.
I would have actually might have tried.
And a question from James Malkow. Hey, James. Is it true that the Hudson River counts as a fjord only where the highlands feature high cliffs emerging from the water?
Well, not strictly speaking, no. And some people would argue with that. But there's a very convincing paper written by a geologist named Alan Newman, back in the 70s or 80s, that lays out the case for it being a fjord. And if you consult your roadside guide to geology of New York State, it'll call it a fjord. No, remember that I mentioned that one of the characteristics of a fjord is the fact that it's deeper upstream of its mouth, and that at the narrows, it's the bedrock bottom of the system is about 200 feet down, whereas at the Tappan Zee and up into the highlands, it's over 700 feet down. So in fact, the whole system in that sense would qualify as a fjord. I don't know that, although the over-steepened slopes are one of the characteristics, I don't know that they're the defining one. Some people might call it a near fjord or a stillborn fjord.
Okay. A question from Denise. I have seen shells in the Croton Point area. They appear to be oyster shells. Could you confirm?
Yes, they probably are. As a matter of fact, Croton Point was heavily used by indigenous peoples along the river. And of course, they didn't have a means of moving things like oysters any great distance. So they would have harvested them and then disposed of them right there. And there are extensive middens, essentially garbage heaps of oyster shells at Croton Point. But again, since they wouldn't have gone a great distance to find them, those oysters existed in the Hudson off Croton Point. And mapping of the river bottom is found very old. I believe they're described as fossil oyster beds in the Tappan Zee. And in the 1950s, commercial oyster growing companies, up to the 1950s, commercial oyster growing companies from Long Island would raise very young oysters in the lower Hudson and then transfer them to waters off Long Island. But a few hurricanes that sent big freshwater plumes down the river, as you saw with Irene, led to the demise of that particular use of the river because it killed all the young oysters, and the oystermen decided that just didn't promise well for the future.
Going back to the zebra mussels, do any other animals eat zebra mussels?
Yes, and I'm going to leave an extensive answer of that question to Dave Strayer, because I am pretty sure he will talk about that. Yes, blue crabs eat them, we think. I'm pretty sure. And sunfish have been observed to eat zebra mussels. And it's interesting what the impact of that predation has been on the zebra mussel population. I'm sure Dave will talk more about that.
Great. And I think Dave is the fourth speaker, if I'm not mistaken.
That's correct.
Okay.
February 3rd, I believe, is the date.
So that'll be February 3rd. Yeah. So tune in for Dave on February 3rd. Question from Tom. Is it possible that the salt layer can be ebbing while the fresh water is flooding?
Well, it's certainly possible that in any given section of the river, you can have currents going in opposite directions. And a great time to see this actually is in the winter when there's ice on the top. So you may see the current going one way along the shore and another direction along the main channel. Whether it happens vertically, between top and bottom, it may. I would imagine that at the turn of the tide, you might see things starting to move at the top more quickly. Like, let's say you're going from a flood to an ebb. In other words, going from flowing upriver to flowing downriver. It might be that the fresh water at the surface would start that southward trend more quickly than, and perhaps while the dense salt water layer is still pushing north. I can't be really sure of that. You need a better oceanographer than me to answer that question accurately.
Okay, so it's 8:34 now, so we're running a little bit over time. There are still some questions in the chat, but there's one in particular, Steve, that I'd really love for you to have a chance to answer before we end for the night. Lynn Cherry has asked, can you say a little about the status of the Clearwater and its education programs?
Sure. Obviously we're still under COVID pandemic situations, so it's a little uncertain as to what the coming sailing season will bring. I can say that we're hoping and planning that we'll be able to sail with passengers, perhaps a smaller complement of passengers than we might otherwise, hopefully starting in the early summer. And that would mean that we'd be able to take the public out on the boat and do education sails and continue to do that into the early fall. But again, that's a hope. We think with the vaccination and with the arrival of the warmer weather that might be possible, but we can't guarantee it at this point.
And I'll throw in at the education programs, we have a wonderful selection of virtual programming that's available for schools, and those are currently available now. And if you know of any classes that you think would be interested, we'd love to talk to you about it.
Certainly, there's a whole library, actually, a virtual learning library on the website. Check it out if you're a teacher, even if you're not, because some of the videos there are both informative and quite amusing.
I agree. So Steve, do you have the energy to do a couple more questions or
Yeah, I certainly do. Obviously, okay. If people, we've been on for an hour, a little over, so if folks have to go, I certainly understand, but I'm happy to answer a few more questions myself.
Okay, I will shoot some more questions to you then. Diane had a question, is the Hudson dredged to keep the depth at 32 feet since it seems that it might occasionally get filled in?
It is, well, it regularly fills in. I mean, think about the impacts of uh, Tropical Storm Irene and all that mud that came down off the watershed. That settled down not only in the shallows, but in the middle of the river as well. So yes, it does have to be dredged fairly regularly. I don't know if there's a set schedule, but uh, the Army Corps of Engineers will do charting of the river. They encourage reports from mariners of areas where it seems to be shallower than is shown on the charts, and they will use that sort of information in order to plot out a dredging program. Most of the dredging takes place. I mean, there's a lot of it in New York Harbor to allow access to the berths of New York Harbor. Upriver, most of it takes place from Kingston north. Uh, there is, and from Catskill and Hudson north, the channel of the river is virtually all dredged for the ships. In the lower river, the only significant dredged portion is in Haverstraw Bay, which, as you saw on the chart, is quite shallow. And there is dredging that goes on there to maintain the channel through that bay.
Um, uh, and John asks, was there a delta at the mouth in the early days of New York settlement?
That's an interesting question. Probably not. The closest thing that the entire river has to a delta is actually in the area up near Albany. And it's not really a delta, but what's interesting about that is that as you look at the size of the grains of sediment moving along the Hudson, it gets coarser as you move north. The reason for that, of course, is that water can carry sediment based on the velocity of its currents. More velocity, if there's higher speed of the water, then it can carry heavier sediment. Where it slows down, then it's got to drop that sediment and it can only carry very fine materials. So much of the heavier particles, the sand and things larger than that would have come out of the upper Hudson and out of the Mohawk in particular. Most of the sediments, 50% of the sediment coming into the Hudson comes out of the Mohawk Valley, down the Mohawk River. Most of that would have settled down, at least the coarser stuff would have settled down pretty close to Albany. And that's in large part why it is so shallow and why there's so many islands and flats up there. So that's about the closest thing that the Hudson has to true delta, but I wouldn't really call it one, just sort of the closest thing that we can point to.
And I have two questions for our final question to you, Steve. Two that are related. Diane asks, what is the most effective thing us regular folks can do to improve Hudson water quality? And Al, related to that, is asking, would you recommend eating anything from the Hudson?
I'll start with the second question first. The New York State Department of Health has guidelines for eating fish and crabs from the Hudson River. They vary depending on what species, on where you are on the river, on your sex, on your age. It's sort of a mixed bag, but they have information. Clearwater actually can provide a lot of that information too if you're interested. But in general, women of childbearing age and young children are advised not to eat most fish from the Hudson River. There are some species that are safer than others if you're going to eat fish. The shad, for example, although they're no longer available, were quite safe even a few years ago because they spend so much time. It has to do with the life history of the fish in part. In the case of shad, they spend most of their time out in the ocean. They're born in the Hudson, but within a few months they swim out to the ocean. They spend 4 years there before they come back to the Hudson. They eat low on the food chain, so they're not getting large concentrations of PCBs. And when they enter the Hudson, they don't eat. So their levels of PCBs were very low. On the other hand, fish like an eel or a catfish, which tends to eat higher on the food chain and is a permanent resident of the Hudson, for at least in the case of the eel, for They actually swim in from the ocean and then spend 10 to 20 or more years here in the Hudson. They can build up quite a level of PCBs, so they're not a good idea to eat them. The big geographic difference happens at the Troy Dam. North of the Troy Dam, you're not allowed to keep any fish and eat them. You have to throw any fish you catch back because, of course, the major source of PCBs comes from the upper Hudson, Fort Edward, and Hudson Falls. And so in that area of the river north of Albany up to Fort Edward, you're not allowed to keep any of the fish you catch. It's a law. Below the Troy Dam, your catch is subject to the advisories that I just mentioned, depending on species, your gender, your age, and where you are on the river. To the first question, what can individuals do? Just keep in mind that I try to make the point that what goes into the water in the watershed ends up in the Hudson in many cases. You know, that slide I showed that had the information about fertilizers on the Hudson, for example. That's something you can do to impact water quality in the streams near you and ultimately in the Hudson, is to minimize your use of fertilizers, or to use it in times of year and in ways that are going to minimize runoff, and instead allow it to be absorbed by the soil and the plants that you're trying to encourage.
We had one late arriving question, which I think is a great one. Is it safe to kayak, swim, or swim in the river?
The brief answer is yes. I've swum in the river quite a bit. Their water quality in general is high enough to swim. A couple of provisos here. There are very few public beaches that have lifeguards. There's one in Croton, there's one in Kingston, there is a floating swimming pool in Beacon. There used to be a swimming beach in just below Saugerties at an Ulster County park there. I understand that's been closed. But water quality supports swimming there, with an exception, and that is that after it rains, I made brief mention of a problem called combined sewer overflows. In many of the older communities along the river, when it rains, the runoff that goes down your storm drains is combined with the runoff or the water coming out of your bathrooms, out of your households. And if the storm water runoff is very high in volume, then it can overwhelm the sewage treatment plant and damage it. So in those cases, there are automatic safeguards, basically, that divert everything into the Hudson, sewage and stormwater runoff. So you'd be well advised not to go swimming after a heavy rain. If you want more information about that, the Riverkeeper tracks bacteria levels on the Hudson. A couple of times a month, they have a cruise up and down the river where they track bacteria levels. Won't necessarily help you on a given day, but it'll give you some sense of where the water is generally good for swimming and other places which can be problematic. Eating fish I talked about. Kayaking. Kayaking is fine anywhere. The main issue there, and also this is true for swimming as well, is safety. The water is pretty turbid. You can't necessarily see what's under the water. And you don't want to be swimming along and actually fetch up on an old log or a rock that you don't see, or an old car. So that's an issue for swimming. And it's an issue for kayaking. More of an issue for kayaking is safety, given that the river is a commercial waterway and there's very large vessels that just can't stop on a dime. I've heard horror stories from Hudson River pilots of small sailboats or kayaks, cutting across their bow, not realizing that these boats, these ships take a mile to stop. And you don't want to be right in front of these boats. Be really observant of their travels on the river. And they often are moving a lot more quickly than you think they are.
Okay, and we've answered all of the questions.
Well, again, thanks to all who signed on, and I encourage you to take in the next 3 presentations The presenters, Roger and Brian and Dave, are well worth hearing. They have incredible knowledge of the river and are great presenters and teachers as well. So I hope you'll join them. And thank you again for joining us tonight.